you for that exceedingly generous welcome. No pressure on me then, huh? It's a real honor to be invited here, and I have to say, somewhat daunting to be presenting the opening talk at this conference. And when Carol sent me the email invitation to speak here, she included this text, which you are no doubt familiar with, to inform me of the conference's theme. And I have to confess that the academic, or rather the pedant in me, maybe start questioning some of these claims. However, emboldened by the suggestion of provocative talks, although fearing I may never be invited here again, I thought that it might be interesting to examine some of the claims that had caused me some disquiet in relation to my particular field of work, which in practical terms is concerned with affording visible voices to global linguistic communities. And my primary but not sole focus today will be those of South Asia. And therefore, I'd like to consider particular issues that I've picked out here, and which I have listed here, although not necessarily in the same order, and to consider these in relation to non-Latin type design, wearing my various hats of type historian, educator, and practitioner. I should say at the outset, clearly the term non-Latin is problematic, but it is arguably better than some others employed in the past and can be a useful umbrella term, but let's really not delve into this issue now. So in agreement with what I believe to be the underlying premise of the conference's theme, it is my conviction that current digital technology offers the best means typographically of representing different writing systems worldwide. Now, I have been saying this probably for the last 30 years, as type-making technologies have constantly improved, but it is now even more valid and of particular significance in this year, 2019, which has been declared by UNESCO to be the International Year of Indigenous Languages. But we do need to be aware of language loss. UNESCO has highlighted the dangers of language loss and the critical risks confronting indigenous languages. And the spreadsheet showing the numbers of endangered and also now extinct languages provided by UNESCO is just too large to show on one slide. So I'm going to give you one figure that relates to my concern with South Asian languages. The People's Linguistic Survey of India of 2013 recorded the loss of 250 languages from the Indian subcontinent alone in the previous 50 years. Well, on a positive note, one crucial way of arresting such loss is through the visible representation of language that, as UNESCO advocates, provides access to information and communication tools. And with respect to contemporary needs, one special session at UNESCO's launch was entitled Establishing Digital Gateways for Indigenous Language Users. And there are indeed current typographic development tools that we know about to facilitate this, including those concerned with the preservation or revival of endangered scripts, for instance, Koshki here. Well, as I'm sure we here are all aware that the majority of the world uses non-Latin writing systems, a fact that regrettably has not been represented in the development and availability of high-quality fonts with respect to their number or range of styles. Yet we do know from histories of print cultures that printing in non-Latin scripts predates that in Latin, not only by means of xylography, as shown here, but also by movable type in East Asia. And even metal type is known to have been successfully produced in Korea in the 13th century. However, many languages and their associated scripts only achieved accurate representation in type some centuries after Latin script incunabula. Well, history shows that the early types of many scripts were for the most part created by Europeans, usually for missionary or political activities. And the quality of these types in terms of replicating the written hand was often questionable, particularly as they tended to show misguided interpretations of manuscript styles. And here we see the first extant Arabic book printed in movable metal type. And the first known book to have been printed in an Indian script was a small catechism in Tamil, printed with movable metal type, cast by Jesuits in 1577 at Goa in India, and a second edition shown here, with a second set of improved types at Ceylon in 1578. Actually, this page shows both these types. But however, these awkwardly shaped early types do not relate directly to today's reading experience. In fact, with regard to South Asian scripts that are employed by over 1/5 of the world's population, it was not until the mid-19th century that their typographic development can be said to have begun in earnest. And it is from this period onwards that we witness the shaping of the printed letter forms that evolved into the textual communication of languages that we currently encounter. Well, as those here who know me will confirm, it has long been my contention that understanding past practices, typographic conventions, script requirements, as well as cultural traditions for whichever script, help us make intelligent, informed decisions and contributes to best practice in the typographic representation of language. So in other words, we need to look to the past to comprehend and evaluate the present for the benefit of the future. And in this field, type histories, as distinct from print histories, are often unreliable, incomplete, or simply lacking. Yet scrutiny of actual imprints, such as those shown here, can yield much information and can help us construct a more accurate and nuanced record of how languages acquired their visible forms that continue to shape readers' experiences today, either in print or on screen. This is my water moment. Sorry. Well, the largely undocumented transition of incised or handwritten letter forms to type forms for South Asian scripts has hardly been a straightforward process. The consequent visible outcomes reveal much about the context in which they were developed, reflecting the motivating factors behind their conception, the political, cultural, and economic climate in which they were created, and of course the experience and skills of those involved in the process. So before turning to the issue of typefaces, let's look at designers, or more accurately, at those behind the designs and the design process. Well, this publication is of particular interest, not only for its approach to Indian script type design that influenced type-making ventures, but also on account of its reporting or misleading reporting of the type-making process. Well, according to the often quoted preface of this publication, the Bengali types, commissioned by the then Governor-General of India, were cut and cast in India single-handedly by Charles Wilkins, who was to become printer to the Honourable Company's Press, that is the East India Company, and he was subsequently knighted for his various activities, and here he is in his later years. Well, the preface states that Wilkins undertook all the various occupations of, I quote, the metallurgist, the engraver, the founder, and the printer. And other accounts record that with the exception of the paper and Roman type, he not only formed every article requisite for the work, but literally printed it with no other assistance or advice than the directions for the several branches in Chambers' Cyclopedia. Well, such claims do not stand up to scrutiny, no matter how authoritative the source may seem, not least on account of the sheer physical impossibility of completing them within the time frame, even for a professional punch cutter, type founder, compositor, and printer, which Wilkins was not. And Wilkins is also reputed to have achieved a similar feat in a shorter time in designing and casting a Nastaliq font shown here. I quote, by the labor of his own hand, from the metal in its crudest state through all the different stages of engraving and founding. So seemingly first-hand accounts of typographic ventures require interrogation. And further research, detective work if you like, indicates that Wilkins was aided by a skilled engraver, Joseph Shepherd, who assisted Wilkins, for which that gentleman assumed or received exclusive merit with its consequent profit or praise. And we also know that at some stage he was assisted by a local blacksmith, Panchanana Kamakara, who went on to work at the Serampore Mission Press, established by William Carey in the then Danish territory beyond Calcutta. But the lack of acknowledgement of existence of assistance in typographic ventures is a regrettable practice that seems to permeate vernacular type history. For instance, the output of the Serampore Mission Press was immense. Outreach was a priority. Between 1801 and 1832, the Mission Press is known to have published over 212,000 volumes in 40 languages. The reliance of the missionaries on local assistance in translating, cutting, casting, composing, and printing is undisputed. However, the publications themselves give little credit even to the Indian translators. But this did not concern William Carey, who received most of the credit himself. And the junior missionaries who deserted Serampore and founded the Calcutta Baptist Missionary Society and Press felt bound to comment on the credit accrued to the three senior missionaries. They wrote, "Their praises were so loud and so often iterated that the labours of others equally indefatigable were yet deemed worthy of little notice, and their names never pronounced except in tones very subdued." And it was the founders of the Baptist Mission Press, who first showed attempts to marry a comprehension of the script with typographic professionalism. And these Serampore deserters, who were skilled punch cutters and printers, engaged with Bengali writing masters such as Kalikumara Raya, and the resulting elegant and often experimental designs accorded with the scribal tradition following the customary Bengali stroke modulation, that is the reverse of Latin. And so from this point on, we see the gradual growth of indigenous type foundries or type founding activities attached to various presses in South Asia that address the needs for vernacular communication rather than to further evangelical or political interests. Foundries such as this one established by Jovdi Dadaji, who founded the renowned Ninaya Saga Press. And these foundries found solutions particularly suitable for South Asian script type founding and typesetting that often required large arrays of characters whose numbers of sorts varied depending on the method of composition, as indicated here. Labour was clearly shared, but it is really difficult to assess who made which decisions in the type-making process that contributed to the final image. The designation and indeed profession of type designer is relatively recent. But in terms of sheer numbers of those involved in the design process, we do know these were often numerous and increased with the commercialization of type founding and did not necessarily diminish with mechanization of punch cutting and subsequently type founding. Although clearly the nature of the tasks and therefore the skills required changed. Well, Walter Tracy, who worked as manager of typeface development at the British Company of Linotype and Machinery from 1948 for some 30 years, identified three different kinds of punch cutters prior to its mechanization. He referred to one kind described here as a designer punch cutter who was capable of influencing the appearance of type, indeed of creating a new effect altogether. And the tacit knowledge of the skilled hand punch cutter was difficult to incorporate into pantographic punch cutting that facilitated the mechanization of type founding and typesetting in the industrial era. Sorry, being in the US, I should have said these are from Britain, these images. And later designers like Eric Gill and Jan van Krimpen would criticize the interpretation of their letterform sketches by those in the Monotype Drawing Office. And the British Drawing Office would produce the technical drawings for punch cutting production and was staffed principally by women since its inception in 1910. And David Saunders, who had a long association with Monotype, having joined in the 1950s, has stated that those who made the working drawings, in most cases, never met the designers of the artwork. I used to think the men at the back were holding some sort of terrible punishment whip thing, but actually they are pantographs, just to be clear. So David Saunders has said, the people who made the drawings, known as drawing clerks, were not designers, and they knew little about type on the page, Their job was to render the designer's drawings in a form in which it could pass through a whole series of operations and represent accurately his intentions on the page. And the practice at Linotype would not have been too dissimilar during the hot metal era, at least in Britain. But both companies employed school leavers for this work, who they trained in-house. And both of these major companies undertook non-Latin type design in their drawing offices that at times were staffed by a great number of people whose artwork and whose decisions on the type forms they produced would be read in printed matter in other continents across the world. So I've managed to sneak my favorite picture in, yes, as this slightly earlier image testifies. The Linotype machines here would have been for English language composition only. Linotype Bengali was finally launched some 12 years later as a result of many years of international collaboration in 3 continents. For various reasons, it was decided that the Bengali letter forms were to be designed quite rightly in India. The patterns, punches, and matrices were to be manufactured in America at Mergenthaler Linotype Company, and the project coordinated in England. And as you can imagine from this picture alone, these projects were conducted in the days long before email or even telex and fax. Communication and coordination were huge problems. And unfortunately, although at least one newspaper report mentions the artist involved in the project as Sushil Kumar Bhattacharya, his name is not to be found in any of the Linotype records that I've been able to access. Well, creative design opportunities for staff in these companies did arise in the digital era, and we see the emergence of those working in drawing offices as designers or full collaborators in the design process. And indeed, Walter Tracy, after his retirement, criticised me when I was working at Linotype for staffing the UK Linotype drawing office with university graduates rather than school leavers. He said it would lead to trouble, as they would only question me. And I told him that is precisely what I needed. Many of the projects in which I was involved benefited greatly from information supplied by colleagues, some of whom are shown here, in the Middle East, India, and Pakistan, who were in constant contact with the users. And we collaborated with external designers such as the supremely talented Tim Holloway. He actually worked at Linotype for a brief spell before this. And he was the principal designer of this project of Nastaliq, the preferred script for Urdu in Pakistan. And so at this stage, the software programmer has now become a crucial collaborator in the design process. And also, we can name such people now, as you see on the patent. However, companies like Monotype and Linotype, which had a sister drawing office here in New York, were not keen to name those who worked on typeface designs unless they were already celebrated designers. Well, thankfully, such practice is being overturned, and it is only lately that some of the names to the many invisible hands have come to light. Many of the drawing offices of large companies situated around the world have closed since the advent of desktop publishing in particular, and rather we see design studios engaging in type design. And we have a growing number of courses that teach type design, and it is a subject on which one can now be examined. To save embarrassment, I have deliberately only shown their hands. Okay. So with regard to typefaces, in terms of quality and the choice of available usable fonts, the golden age of typeface design for South Asian scripts was arguably in the days of foundry type, as mechanization with the limitations it imposed had a profound and enduring impact on many scripts, for which the Monotype and Linotype hot metal machines had never been designed, and the impact is still with us. Nonetheless, it is important to realize that new typemaking and typesetting technologies by no means superseded older technologies, but they would often run in parallel and still do on a minor level in metal or wood, as is evidenced by the dates shown here. Well, monotype composition fared better than that produced by the Linotype machine, but it had certain restrictions that affected the typographic outcomes. And these two texts are identical. They're actually identical texts, but I think you can see that the texture on the page is different, largely due to the fitting as well as some of the character shaping. And if you can compare the underlined words, the second word in on each paragraph. The first contains a vertically stacked form, but the monotype samples contains a linear form that's joined horizontally. However, the linotype machine that was preferred for newspaper composition greatly affected, well, some say mutilated, South Asian scripts on account of its drastic character set limitations and its inability to kern. And the result was a far cry from foundry type, yet it enabled the wide dissemination of information and ultimately redefined what was to become acceptable as legible typography, as this newspaper headline shows with gaps in the text. And in comparison with the same text set in the digital linotype Bengali typeface. Aside from the ability of the later fonts to kern and position accents accurately, digital composition enabled the reintroduction of characters not seen in newsprint for 40 years, such as those underlined. Well, I mentioned big names earlier, and some were involved in the development of Indian script typefaces in different ways. Many South Asian scripts bypassed film setting technology on their transition from metal to digital typesetting. But Matthew Carter was commissioned to design a Devanagari font for the VIP film setter. And this stepping stone to digital type showed huge improvements over hot metal, but some character set restrictions and the accent placement routine provided a few problems, as I've circled here. However, this development laid down the foundation for the digital version undertaken by me and my team at Linotype, which occasioned some reassessment of the Linotype Devanagari, resulting in some revisions and the addition of some 200 glyphs. Well, Adrian Frudiger's foray into South Asian type design with Mahendra Patel was less successful than Matthew's and was problematic owing to some of the design choices made. The Devanagari designs, there was a high contrast and a low contrast style, created in 1972 for monotype, were ahead of their time in terms of styling, but were also very difficult to read. So aside from strange proportions and fitting, the bottom low contrast typeface possesses shapes of markedly European appearance due to the reverse stroke modulation. The broad nib Indian pen, as mentioned earlier, is cut in the reverse direction to that for Latin, so that bowls thicken rather than thin when joining the vertical stroke. And the first shape here on the left being correct. And this is essential for readability. So my question to you would be, would you be happy with the right-hand lowercase a for Latin? Is that a choice you might make, particularly for text composition? We do see this phenomenon of reverse contrast replicated even in some Devanagari open types today, and I'm uncertain of the rationale behind this. However, we do have answers as to why some of the forms of many scripts have acquired their shaping at key moments in time, and it is, I feel, important to interrogate the continued use of particular practices and revise where appropriate. In other words, to make informed choices about character shaping to exploit the latest technology to achieve optimum readability of texts. Now, these listed here comprise the first digital South Asian fonts, which were created during the early 1980s at Linotype UK under my watch. Now, most were considered innovative, groundbreaking designs and were employed in many newspapers. Unfortunately, they can hardly be said to have acted as catalysts for original type designs. Well, of course, the emergence of digital technology and subsequently personalized computers with accessible and affordable typemaking software has enabled a proliferation of typefaces. However, we are confronted with the continued paucity of high-quality fonts for many non-Latin scripts. So although these Linotype typefaces I just showed are no longer available since Linotype UK shut its doors in 1996, many continue to appear on a daily basis in cloned versions. For instance, all 4 daily Bengali newspapers employ Linotype Bengali, affectionately now known as ABP Bengali because the top one left, which is Ananda Bazar Patrika, ABP, is entitled to do so. The same goes for the magazines, and we even find it in wayfinding. In other scripts, we tend to find a cacophony of the use of often cloned fonts that used inadequate software and which are electronically manipulated to curious effect. I invite you to have a look at the headline, bottom right. which was Linotype Devanagari. It has been stated that recent developments designed specifically to overcome many issues that previously compromised non-Latin typography have in turn benefited Latin designs. So, for instance, large character sets and contextual forms. So it seems curious that new possibilities in the typographic rendition of South Asian scripts in particular have not occasioned a reassessment of typographic practices. We can make use of historical sources to inform ourselves and to counter a number of myths about certain practices. So these manuscripts, amongst many others, testify to the fact that slanted styles are not a colonial imposition on Tamil typography. Furthermore, monolinear letter forms are the natural form for these scripts written with a stylus. Therefore, low contrast typefaces in these scripts can hardly be called a modern stylistic treatment to accompany a Latin sans, as has been frequently stated. Rather, a key question that merits investigation is why the development of types for South India and Sri Lanka shows a predilection for high contrast forms, as shown in this typeface below, when manuscripts were written with a stylus on palm leaf. And in fact, the types produced by many indigenous foundries for South Indian scripts appear to show the influence of the European split-nib pen rather than Indian penmanship. And there are countless other questions that I could spend all day talking about. So I should stop here and add that there have indeed been some significant improvements over the last 30 years, not least spurred on by the activities of a number of people in this room. I believe that the pooling of skills in the design process, the sharing of information, and the striving of excellence through the use of new and emerging technologies can result in improved visible outcomes for more languages and characters by more designers to provide more typefaces and such scripts such as those millions who need to resort to the Latin script to send text messages, who deserve more choices, and above all, for those who still lack any visible voice. So my work has largely been on collaborative projects in response to the cultural needs of diverse communities. So therefore, I am truly heartened to see some of the recent results of the TDC competition that have passed rigorous examination, receiving awards for design excellence, for typefaces that will enrich the future of textual vernacular communication by typographic means. Thank you.